I am drowning while searching for my voice, and the world sees me as a role, not as a person. Nia stood in front of her canvas, feeling a deep struggle inside her. The art she created was now crushed under the weight of the world's expectations. She was constantly told that she was only a black artist, and her work had to be a mirror of politics or pain. But was that really her truth? Did she have to mold her creations into the boxes the world had set for her? One day, she decided to embrace her own truth to show joy, love, and freedom through her art. And when she did, she realized she had truly understood what freedom meant. So, wherever you are, is the world's pressure weighing down on you too? If yes, it's time for you to free your voice as well. By the way, which city are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments. If this message touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel and be part of this movement. Every brushstroke, every color, every inch of this canvas feels like a fight to be seen as who I am, not just what they want me to be. The room was filled with the hum of murmured voices, the clinking of wine glasses, and the soft shuffle of footsteps on the hardwood floors. Her work hung on the walls, vibrant and raw, each piece telling a story that had been whispered through generations. Yet, as her eyes scanned the crowd, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't looking at her art, they were looking at her. She wasn't a painter, an artist, or even a creator. She was, in their eyes, a black artist. Nia's work had always been more than just paint on a canvas. It was a reflection of who she was, of the stories passed down through her family, the cultural rituals and struggles she'd inherited. But here, in this gallery surrounded by white critics and buyers, those stories seemed to vanish into the ether. Instead of discussing the meaning behind the brushstrokes, they wanted to know where the authenticity came from, why the colors seemed so raw, or why the figures in her paintings had a sense of desperation they didn't understand. They didn't want to understand. At first, it had felt like validation. The invitations to exclusive art shows, the private viewings, the praise from renowned critics who marveled at her unique vision. But with each compliment, there was an underlying question that lingered. Was it her art they saw, or was it her race that defined her work in their eyes? It wasn't until one evening, after an acclaimed gallery opening, that Nia overheard a conversation that shook her to the core. A fellow artist, a well-established white man with a collection of accolades as long as Nia's career was young, discussed the latest trend in the art world, the black experience. His words were dismissive, almost as if it was some passing phase that was expected to make waves for a while before fading into obscurity. "It's just the thing right now," he said with a chuckle. "People are eating it up." That moment stung worse than any critique she had received in her career. Her art, her identity, her truth was being commodified, reduced to nothing more than a trend, a movement that was, in his words, temporary. Was this the world she had fought so hard to be part of? A world where her art was valued not for its complexity, but for how it could be packaged and sold to a predominantly white audience that only wanted the surface of her identity, not the depth. Nia's paintings spoke of the black experience, but not in the way they expected. Her work wasn't a caricature of pain and suffering. It wasn't just a depiction of historical events for consumption. Her art was a celebration, a raw portrayal of the beauty and resilience of her community. It was about finding strength in struggle, about the small moments of joy amid hardship, about the colors of blackness in all its forms. Yet, as she moved deeper into the art world, she began to feel like she was constantly being asked to prove that it was real enough, genuine enough, authentic enough. Her identity had become a spectacle, something that could be admired from a distance but never truly understood. The comments, though veiled in compliments, made her question everything. "It's so raw," they'd say, as if pain and struggle were the only truths in her art. It really speaks to the Black experience, but what did that mean? Did they understand what her art represented? Or did they only understand the version of Blackness that they could digest? Nya had come to realize that no matter how much recognition she received, no matter how many prestigious galleries displayed her work, she was still bound by her race in the eyes of the art world. Her identity was both the key to her success and the chains that held her within it. She could not exist as just an artist. She existed as the Black artist, the one who was expected to speak on behalf of an entire community, the one who was placed on a pedestal only to be ogled at from afar. The more her work gained traction, the more she was confronted with these uncomfortable truths. The invitations to exhibit her art, the offers to collaborate with renowned curators, all came with an unspoken understanding. They were not interested in her work as a unique expression of her soul. They were interested in her identity as a tool to bring diversity to their predominantly white spaces, and the questions came. How do you feel about your heritage influencing your work? Is your art a form of resistance? Do you think your race makes your art more authentic? She'd always answered politely, but each time, the question chipped away at her. Was her art defined by her race? Was her Blackness its only true meaning? The internal conflict twisted inside her. Was her worth as an artist only valid because of her identity, or did she have the right to be seen simply as an artist, without the burden of being representative of her entire race? One day, she couldn't take it anymore. In a private viewing, as the room buzzed with whispered praise and polite applause, Nya stepped away from the crowd, hiding herself in a quiet corner. She looked at the piece she had worked on for weeks, pouring her soul into it. It was a reflection of her childhood memories, bright, bold colors that danced across the canvas, abstract but deeply personal. She had wanted to capture the feeling of freedom, of being in tune with something larger than herself, of feeling rooted in the community that raised her, yet all they saw was her Blackness. She felt like a fraud. In that moment, Ya made a decision. If she was to be valued only for her race, then perhaps it was time to redefine what that race meant to her and how it showed up in her work. She would no longer allow her identity to be a tool for their satisfaction. She would push further, delve deeper, and expose the layers of Blackness that they were too afraid to understand. But it wouldn't be for them, it would be for her. From that night forward, Nya began to create in a way she never had before. She let go of the need for validation. The pieces she created were no longer bound by what the world expected her art to be. It became more intimate, more raw, more complex. She painted the stories that only she could tell, stories not for the eyes of critics, but for her own heart. It was terrifying, knowing that her work might never be marketable again, knowing that she might lose everything she had worked for. But she had lost herself in the process, and she wasn't willing to do that any longer. Her art, for the first time, was truly her own, and maybe that was the most authentic piece of all. The world might never fully understand it, but in that quiet studio, with the smell of paint and the hum of her own heartbeat, Nya realized something she had forgotten. The value of her work was never meant to be defined by them. It was defined by her, by the layers of her identity, her story, her trait. In a world where money talks, my soul is the price I'm being asked to pay. The invitation had come as a shock. An exclusive offer to showcase her work in one of the most prestigious galleries in the country. It was a dream come true except for one thing. The price tag attached to it wasn't just in terms of money. It was a price that went far deeper than she was prepared for. As Nya entered the grand gallery, its sterile white walls felt like a stark contrast to the vibrant energy of her work. Her paintings, full of life, bursting with colors that spoke to the Black experience, seemed out of place against the cold, minimalist decor. It wasn't that her art wasn't appreciated, it was, in fact, admired. But the way it was admired made her uneasy. The director of the gallery, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit, was overly effusive as he led Nya through the space. "Your work is going to be a huge success here, Nya," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "The critics are going to eat this up, you'll be the next big thing." His words felt hollow. She could hear the unspoken conditions, the expectations of what success should look like, what she should do, and what parts of her art would make them the most money. "How do you feel about adapting your style for a wider audience?" he asked casually as they walked through the gallery. "You know, making it more accessible." The words hit her like a slap. Nya paused, her mind racing. Accessible. What did that mean? Did it mean watering down her message to appeal to a broader, predominantly white audience? Did it mean removing the raw, unfiltered edges of her art to make it more palatable, to fit into the mold of what people were comfortable with? The thought of compromising her artistic integrity made her stomach twist. She had worked too hard to get to this point, pouring her heart into each brushstroke. Her art wasn't just for sale, it was a part of her, a reflection of her experiences as a black woman navigating a world that often overlooked her, a world that saw her as other. To dilute her truth in exchange for success was unthinkable. But then again, she couldn't ignore the offer that hung in front of her. This was the chance to be recognized on a larger stage. Her art could reach people she'd never dreamed of. The validation, the exposure, the commercial success, it was all within her grasp. But at what cost? The emotional weight of that decision gnawed at her. The gallery's director wasn't the only one who saw her art as a tool for success. The critics, who seemed to view her work through a lens of marketability rather than authenticity. One critic had called her latest piece provocative, praising the bold use of color to represent the struggle of black identity. But as Nya read between the lines, she realized that the word provocative was often code for controversial, and controversy often sold better than subtlety. The internal conflict was tearing her apart. On one hand, she longed for success, the validation, the recognition, the sense that she wasn't just another forgotten artist. She could feel the world on the edge of discovering the real Nya, the woman behind the paintbrush. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the fear that, once she let herself be molded by the commercial pressures of the art world, she would lose the very thing that made her work unique in the first place. The pressure to conform was suffocating. She received calls from well-meaning but misguided collectors who suggested she tone down certain elements of her work to appeal to the masses. "Why don't you make it more universal?" they said, as if being black wasn't universal enough. They didn't understand the power of her voice, the strength in her raw depiction of blackness. All they saw was a marketable asset, something they could sell, something they could consume, not something that could challenge or provoke thought. One day, during a meeting with a prominent art dealer, Nya was handed a contract. The terms were clear: her work would be exhibited, but with certain restrictions. They would curate her pieces, placing emphasis on those that would sell well to the high-end buyers. She would be expected to tone down the political messages in her art, to remove any references to racial injustice or systemic oppression. "We want your work to appeal to people from all walks of life," the dealer had said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. For a moment, Nya was silent. The words swirled around in her mind like a storm. Tone down the politics, remove references to oppression. Did they want her to pretend that the world she lived in wasn't shaped by these issues? Did they want her to erase the very fabric of her being? The thought was suffocating. She thought about the years of pain and joy that had shaped her identity, the people who had come before her and fought for a future where she could stand proudly in a gallery and showcase her truth. To remove that would be to erase not only her art, but also her very identity. Yet, the temptation to take the offer lingered. The money, the exposure, the legitimacy in the eyes of the art world. It was so easy to imagine herself falling into that trap, signing the contract, and walking away with the validation she so desperately craved. But she knew it would come at the expense of her soul. The decision became a tormenting loop in her mind. With every offer, every critique, every suggestion to make it more mainstream, Nya found herself at a crossroads. She could conform, bend to the will of the art world, and perhaps finally achieve the success she had longed for. Or she could stand her ground, stay true to herself, and risk being labeled as too niche or too political to ever truly make it. One night, exhausted and drained, Nya sat alone in her studio, surrounded by her paintings. The vibrant colors on the canvas seemed to speak to her, urging her to listen to her heart. She thought about the many nights she had spent crying over her art, pouring out her emotions, capturing the complex layers of blackness, of love, of struggle, and of joy. She thought about her community, about the generations of black people who had fought for their voices to be heard. In that moment, Nya made her decision. She would not compromise. She would not allow her truth to be watered down just to fit into a commercial mold. The world might not be ready for the full force of her art, but she would not let that deter her. If the art world couldn't accept her as she was, then she would find another way. She would find a space where her voice was valued, where her art could exist without being shaped by the demands of the market. She picked up her brush and began to paint with renewed vigor. No more compromises, no more concessions. Her art would remain a reflection of her truth, no matter how much the world tried to mold it into something more digestible. This was her voice, and she would speak it unapologetically. The road ahead would not be easy, but Nya knew one thing for sure: her art, in all its raw, unfiltered truth, was worth more than any amount of commercial success. It was worth more than any gallery contract, more than any offer to water it down. It was worth everything because it was hers. And that, in the end, was the greatest success of all. They don't want my culture. They want the pieces of it that they can sell, that they can wear like an accessory. But they don't want to hear my story, the real one. The night of her most important gallery show was supposed to be a triumph, a culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and passion. Her art, bold, expressive, raw, was being displayed for a crowd of the city's most influential figures. Yet, standing in the midst of the crowd, Nya could hardly feel the excitement she thought she would. Instead, a gnawing sense of disillusionment churned in her gut, the vibrations of a quiet but persistent unease that had been building for months. Her work had been celebrated, but not for the reasons she had hoped. People admired it, yes, but it wasn't the depth, the personal history, or the narrative behind it that caught their attention. No, it was the trend of it. The art world was obsessed with what she had to offer, not as a voice, but as an exotic, marketable novelty. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. The stories she had woven into her work, her intricate exploration of black identity, of the struggles that defined her existence, were being reduced to mere commodities. The paintings, the colors, the symbols, they were seen not as reflections of a painful, complex history, but as something to be consumed, something fashionable for the moment. Like the latest trendy clothing line, there were whispers in the crowd, superficial compliments thrown her way, but they felt empty. A well-dressed woman, standing near a piece depicting a street protest, turned to her friend and casually said, "It's like they took all the best parts of black culture and packaged them into art. It's so raw, so authentic." She laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that felt like genuine appreciation. It was the laugh of someone who didn't understand the weight behind the art, the history it carried, or the pain embedded in the strokes of the brush. It was the laugh of someone who saw it as a thing to consume, to admire from a distance, but never truly understand. Nia's heart sank. She had spent years cultivating these pieces, each one personal, each one a reflection of the complex beauty of black life, a history that had been suppressed and ignored. She picked up her brush and began to paint with renewed vigor. No more compromises, no more concessions. Her art would remain a reflection of her truth, no matter how much the world tried to mold it into something more digestible. This was her voice, and she would speak it unapologetically. The road ahead would not be easy, but Nia knew one thing for sure: her art, in all its raw, unfiltered truth, was worth more than any amount of commercial success. It was worth more than any gallery contract, more than any offer to water it down. It was worth everything because it was hers. And that, in the end, was the greatest success of all. They don't want my culture. They want the pieces of it that they can sell, that they can wear like an accessory. But they don't want to hear my story, the real one. The night of her most important gallery show was supposed to be a triumph, a culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and passion. Her art, bold, expressive, raw, was being displayed for a crowd of the city's most influential figures. Yet, standing in the midst of the crowd, Nia could hardly feel the excitement she thought she would. Instead, a gnawing sense of disillusionment churned in her gut, the vibrations of a quiet but persistent unease that had been building for months. Her work had been celebrated, but not for the reasons she had hoped. People admired it, yes, but it wasn't the depth, the personal history, or the narrative behind it that caught their attention. No, it was the trend of it. The art world was obsessed with what she had to offer, not as a voice, but as an exotic, marketable novelty. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. The stories she had woven into her work, her intricate exploration of black identity, of the struggles that defined her existence, were being reduced to mere commodities. The paintings, the colors, the symbols, they were seen not as reflections of a painful, complex history, but as something to be consumed, something fashionable for the moment, like the latest trendy clothing line. There were whispers in the crowd, superficial compliments thrown her way, but they felt empty. A well-dressed woman, standing near a piece depicting a street protest, turned to her friend and casually said, "It's like they took all the best parts of black culture and packaged them into art. It's so raw, so authentic." She laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that felt like genuine appreciation. It was the laugh of someone who didn't understand the weight behind the art, the history it carried, or the pain embedded in the strokes of the brush. It was the laugh of someone who saw it as a thing to consume, to admire from a distance, but never truly understand. Nia's heart sank. She had spent years cultivating these pieces, each one personal, each one a reflection of the complex beauty of black life, a history that had been suppressed and ignored. She had hoped that through her art, people might gain insight, perhaps even feel empathy. But instead, they were reducing it to a trend, an aesthetic that could be admired without any understanding of what lay beneath it. She picked up her brush and began to paint with renewed vigor. No more compromises, no more concessions. Her art would remain a reflection of her truth, no matter how much the world tried to mold it into something more digestible. This was her voice, and she would speak it unapologetically. The road ahead would not be easy, but Nia knew one thing for sure: her art, in all its raw, unfiltered truth, was worth more than any amount of commercial success. It was worth more than any gallery contract, more than any offer to water it down. It was worth everything because it was hers. And that, in the end, was the greatest success of all. They don't want my culture. They want the pieces of it that they can sell, that they can wear like an accessory. But they don't want to hear my story, the real one. The night of her most important gallery show was supposed to be a triumph, a culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and passion. Her art, bold, expressive, raw, was being displayed for a crowd of the city's most influential figures. Yet, standing in the midst of the crowd, Nya could hardly feel the excitement she thought she would. Instead, a gnawing sense of disillusionment churned in her gut, the vibrations of a quiet but persistent unease that had been building for months. Her work had been celebrated, but not for the reasons she had hoped. People admired it, yes, but it wasn't the depth, the personal history, or the narrative behind it that caught their attention. No, it was the trend of it. The art world was obsessed with what she had to offer, not as a voice, but as an exotic, marketable novelty. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. The stories she had woven into her work, her intricate exploration of Black identity, of the struggles that defined her existence, were being reduced to mere commodities. The paintings, the colors, the symbols, they were seen not as reflections of a painful, complex history, but as something to be consumed, something fashionable for the moment. Like the latest trendy clothing line, there were whispers in the crowd, superficial compliments thrown her way, but they felt empty. A well-dressed woman, standing near a piece depicting a street protest, turned to her friend and casually said, "It's like they took all the best parts of Black culture and packaged them into art. It's so raw, so authentic." She laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that felt like genuine appreciation. It was the laugh of someone who didn't understand the weight behind the art, the history it carried, or the pain embedded in the strokes of the brush. It was the laugh of someone who saw it as a thing to consume, to admire from a distance, but never truly understand. Nia's heart sank. She had spent years cultivating these pieces, each one personal, each one a reflection of the complex beauty of Black life, a history that had been suppressed and ignored. She had hoped that through her art, people might gain insight, perhaps even feel empathy, but instead, they were reducing it to a trend, an aesthetic that could be admired without any understanding of what lay beneath it. Image of blackness that had been commercialized for their enjoyment. They didn't want her truth. They wanted a version of it that fit their needs. That night, she thought long and hard about what her role in the art world should be. Should she conform to the market demands and make art that would ensure her success? Or should she stay true to herself, to the complexities of her identity, and risk never being fully recognized? The pressure to sell out was overwhelming, but Nya couldn't bear the thought of losing herself in the process. Over time, she began to realize that her art, in all its complexity, had a deeper purpose than just being sold. It was about telling the story that no one else wanted to hear. It was about showing the world that Black identity was not a trend, not something to be co-opted, commodified, or simplified. It was a multifaceted, lived experience, one that was too often ignored or misrepresented. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Nya chose to redefine what success meant for her. She would no longer allow her culture to be consumed like a commodity. She would stand her ground, speak her truth, and let the art world know that blackness wasn't a trend, it was a legacy, and it wasn't for sale. As the years passed, Nia's work grew stronger, more defined, more unapologetic. She stopped catering to the demands of the commercial art world and began finding spaces where her voice was respected and heard, where people saw her art for what it truly was, a powerful testament to her identity, to her struggle, and to her triumph. And, for the first time, she felt like she was truly creating art that mattered, not just for the money, not just for the fame, but because it was her truth, and that was worth more than anything the art world could offer. I am drowning in a sea of expectations, both my own and everyone else's, and I'm not sure if I'll ever surface again. Nya stood in front of her canvas, a world of color and emotion in her hands, yet she felt an overwhelming emptiness within. The paintbrush in her grasp was heavy with the weight of the world, her world. The desire to create, to pour herself onto the canvas, was drowned by the suffocating pressure to be authentic. Every stroke felt like an apology, every color a compromise. She had worked her entire life to create art that spoke truth to power, that communicated the layers of Black identity, love, pain, and resistance. But now, as her work gained recognition, she felt something shifting beneath her. It wasn't the art world's applause that bothered her, it was the way it had begun to define her. She was no longer just Nya, the artist. She had become the Black artist, as if her entire identity could be reduced to the color of her skin, as if the intricacies of her life, her emotions, her soul, could be captured in a single label. The art world had placed her in a box. They wanted her to be the voice of Blackness. They expected her work to be a mirror reflecting only the struggles and the pain of her people. They wanted authenticity, yes, but they wanted it in a way that fit their expectations. They wanted her to speak for an entire race, to represent the experience of millions, to make art that screamed Black Lives Matter or oppression, even when she didn't feel those words in her heart at that moment. She was supposed to be a symbol, a brand, something they could hold up as evidence of their diverse and inclusive gallery. The pressure to be authentic was relentless. She had spent years building a career on her terms, telling stories of her community in ways that were raw and unfiltered. But now, the weight of others' expectations was beginning to suffocate her. Her work was no longer just an expression of her feelings and thoughts, it had become a vehicle for political and cultural narratives that she couldn't always align herself with. The more she was asked to define herself, the more she questioned who she really was. Her work had always been her outlet, her way of processing the world around her, but now it felt like an obligation. Every time someone looked at her work, they didn't see her, they saw the Black woman, who was supposed to be angry, oppressed, resistant. They saw the stereotype of what it meant to be Black in a predominantly white art world, and they expected her to perform that role, even if it wasn't true to how she felt at that moment. One evening, after a particularly grueling interview with a major art magazine, Nya found herself in tears. The journalist, a well-meaning but naive young woman, had spent the entire interview asking her to explain the Black experience through her art, to speak about the pain of oppression that was supposedly always embedded in her work. When Nya had tried to explain that her art wasn't just about that, wasn't only about resistance or pain, the journalist had seemed confused, even disappointed. "But your art is so political," she had said, as though political was a box she was supposed to check, as if her personal, individual expression could be reduced to the color of her skin and the politics attached to it. After the interview, Nya felt drained, as though she had given everything she had to a world that didn't want to hear her true voice, the voice that didn't always fit into the narrative they had constructed for her. She had been labeled, boxed in, and forced to conform to an idea of what it meant to be Black in America. But wasn't it her right to be more than that? Wasn't it her right to be more than just the face of a political statement? The pressure only grew when an art dealer, eager to capitalize on her newfound fame, suggested she create a series dedicated exclusively to racial injustice. "You'll make a fortune, Nya," he had said, his voice dripping with enthusiasm. "Everyone is looking for content that speaks to this moment. It's hot. It'll give you the authenticity you need to keep your momentum going." Her stomach turned at the thought. It wasn't that Nya didn't care about racial injustice, she did. But she didn't want to be reduced to a symbol for something that wasn't her full reality. She was not just an artist who created for the sake of political statements. She was a woman, a black woman, whose identity was so much more than the pain she had endured. Her experiences were complex, layered with joy, love, growth, and beauty, not just the sorrow and oppression that the world wanted to see. But the art world didn't want her to be anything else. They wanted her to be authentic, but only in the way they understood authenticity: through struggle, through hardship, through being the token voice that spoke for all of blackness. Nya felt as though she was losing herself, drowning in the tidal wave of expectations. The desire to create freely was slipping through her fingers, and in its place was an overwhelming sense of responsibility to represent something much larger than herself. She wasn't sure if she could handle it anymore. She wasn't sure if she could continue to create for a world that refused to see her as an individual, a person with a voice that was allowed to evolve beyond the confines of her skin. One day, sitting alone in her studio, she realized something: her authenticity was hers to define. It was her right to create art that reflected all parts of who she was, not just the pieces that other people wanted to see. She didn't have to conform to anyone else's narrative. She didn't have to be the angry black artist, the symbol of resistance, if that wasn't who she was at that moment. Her art was her story, and if others couldn't accept that it didn't always fit the mold they had created for her, that was their issue, not hers. The moment of clarity came when she picked up her paintbrush and began working on a new piece, one that had no political agenda, no deep message of struggle. It was simply a painting about joy, about black joy. She painted the laughter of her friends, the moments of love she had shared with her family, the beauty of her culture in its fullness. She wanted to capture the freedom she felt when she was truly herself, without the weight of the world's expectations. When the piece was finished, she stood back and admired it. It wasn't a statement on race, it wasn't a political manifesto. It was a celebration of life, of identity, and of the joy that black people, like all people deserve to experience, free from the burden of expectations. That was the moment Nya realized that authenticity wasn't about meeting others' demands. It was about staying true to herself, to the parts of her that no one else could define. She didn't have to conform to anyone's idea of who she should be, and neither did her art. The next day, when she presented the piece to her gallery, she could see the surprise on their faces. It wasn't what they had expected, and part of her wondered if they would understand it, but she didn't care. This piece was hers, a piece of her soul that was more valuable than any recognition, any accolade, or any label. The critics came, and some were confused. They didn't understand why Nya had chosen to move away from the political edge of her work. But others, those who truly appreciated her as an artist, saw the depth in it. They saw the layers of meaning, the complex portrayal of black identity that included both pain and joy, both struggle and celebration. And for the first time in a long while, Nya felt the freedom to create without restriction, without the burden of expectation. She was authentic, not because she was fulfilling others' definitions of her, but because she was choosing to define herself, her art, and her truth on her own terms. In that freedom, Nya found her voice again, the voice that had been stifled for too long by the weight of other people's ideas of authenticity. And it was the most liberating feeling of all.